Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Let's take a look at some of the stories we're covering for you today. The Senate passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but the majority of Republicans voted no. Now the Senate is taking up the Democrats' sweeping budget bill, funding a variety of social and climate programs. After mounting pressure and calls to resign, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has announced his plan to leave. We have reaction from the White House. A law professor at George Mason University is fighting back against the school. He says he has antibodies for the CCP virus and that he should not be forced to take the vaccine. 19 House Democrats are urging the Capitol to require vaccination proof or take frequent testing. Speaker Nancy Pelosi last week said that once the FDA approves the CCP virus vaccines, it would be easier to establish some sort of mandate. While some concerned Republican lawmakers call on health agencies to be more honest and forthcoming, instead of promoting vaccine mandates.
I don't care what level government is. That should not be their responsibility. Their responsibility is to give me good information. Let me make the darn decision. I get sick and tired of government thinking, some bureaucrat thinks that they're so smart that they can tell me exactly what to do.
At least 5 lawmakers have tested positive in the last 3 weeks, 4 of whom were fully vaccinated. President Biden last month required federal workers to take the vaccine. The Pentagon plans to do the same by mid-September. George Mason University professor Todd Zywicki is suing his employer for what he says the school is violating his constitutional rights. Professor of Law at George Mason University, Professor Todd Zywicki, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Now, Professor, you're pushing back against these forced vaccination mandates at George Mason because you say that you have had the virus, the coronavirus, and that you are just as immune to it as those who have taken the vaccines. You're suing the university that you work at over this mandate. If you could, please tell us, how do you plan on making your case?
Well, to be precise, Steve, it's not just that I'm equally immune to vaccines. I'm equally immune to the protection to the most effective vaccines, and natural immunity, which is in the range of 90 to 95% protection against reinfection, is clearly more protective than against less effective vaccines, such as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is about 66%, even in lab trials. And even worse, the George Mason policy is so bizarre, it recognizes any vaccine approved by the World Health Organization, which includes the very low-quality Chinese vaccines from Sinovac and Sinopharm, which provide almost no protection at all. And so the logic of the case is quite simple, which is that I have a right to bodily integrity. I shouldn't be compelled to undergo a forced medical procedure and without a compelling reason. And the idea that they would compel me to do this when I have natural immunity, when I have a demonstrated antibodies test that shows I have very robust natural immunity, while at the same time allowing these other vaccines to qualify, just doesn't satisfy the constitutional requirements.
Now, Professor, you're in an academic environment being at George Mason University. This is an environment where people are supposed to be able to critically think. You teach people to critically think as a professor. Now, with potentially over 100 million people who have already had this virus and have acquired natural immunity, how do you think this whole topic of people who have acquired natural immunity has been left out of the conversation?
It's very strange, Steve, because in the rest of the world, they recognize natural immunity in various different degrees, whether it's Europe or anywhere else. They recognize that a prior COVID infection provides immunity. What we're learning is every day is that natural immunity is more and more robust, more and more protective. It's been long understood that natural immunity is more protective against variants because the way that it works. But just to give you an example, in Israel, they found in a recent study of 6 million people that breakthrough infections of vaccines are 6.72 times more common than breakthrough infections of natural immunity. And so we've tried to present this data to the university. We've asked the university to live up to what it says on its own vision statement, which is that they're looking for scientifically based, honest, novel solutions to the world's problems. And I'm still hopeful that maybe they'll look at everything we've said and recognize that there's a better way of doing this, which is to recognize immunity no matter how it's granted, rather than this fixation on vaccines as being the only way to do it.
Now, just very quickly, if you could, there are a lot of people in your situation who have acquired this immunity. What can they do if they're in a similar situation like you were?
Well, I'm fortunate in this case that I work for a state institution, state university, so the Constitution applies to my case. Other people can try to, I guess, explain it to their employers, possibly contact lawyers. I've been heartbroken, Steve, to tell the truth, and just shocked. Since we filed this lawsuit, I've gotten hundreds of emails from students and parents and people whose jobs are on the line. I've gotten emails from people who had natural immunity, were talking to getting the vaccine and can't walk now, who can hardly breathe. And the reality is what we know is that it's not just that you don't need to get, if you've got proven antibodies in particular, you don't need to get the vaccination as well if you've got proven protection. But the evidence also indicates that those who have had natural immunity not only face the same side effects that everybody else does, but we actually face elevated side effects from getting the vaccine because it threatens to create a hyperinflammatory response. And so a lot of the nightmare stories you read about people who have had terrible adverse reactions to the vaccines are from being vaccinated after having concurrent or recovered from COVID. So I would ask people, to check their immunity levels, try to stay on top of it so that they don't get infected, but that they also don't inadvertently get vaccinated when they have an actual virus in their system.
Professor Todd Zywicki, professor of law at George Mason University. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene said in a tweet, "These vaccines are failing and do not reduce the spread of the virus, and neither do masks." Twitter has suspended her for a week after this tweet. Greene said, quote, "The FDA should not approve the COVID vaccines," end quote. "There are too many reports of infection and spread of COVID-19 among vaccinated people." She added, quote, "Vaccine mandates and passports violate individual freedoms," end quote. Her account is suspended for 7 days. Greene said in a statement on Tuesday, "Twitter suspended me for speaking the truth and tweeting what so many people are saying." Today, the Senate passed the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package. After weeks of debate and hours of floor debate, it passed 69 to 30. 19 Republicans voted to overcome the 60-vote filibuster, but the majority of Republicans voted no to the bill. The infrastructure package includes around $550 billion in new spending for hard infrastructure and broadband internet access. It includes some of the Democrats' green energy projects like electric vehicles and charging stations and climate change projects. Most Republicans, of course, do not agree with the climate and green energy details in the bill. 30 Republicans voted no to the bill, but the Republicans who oppose it have said they have other reasons for voting no. For one, they're concerned the bill is spending money that it doesn't have on projects it doesn't need. The Congressional Budget Office projected this infrastructure bill will add $256 billion to the budget deficit. That's why Senator Hagerty specifically said he voted no, and one reason why he held up the vote on the bill. Other senators like Senator Rick Scott and Senator Mike Lee are also concerned about the budget deficit, and some Republicans have said they opposed the bill because they didn't want to contribute to fast-tracking the Democrats' $3.5 trillion budget resolution. Senator Chuck Schumer said he'd immediately take up that bill as soon as this infrastructure bill was passed, and that's exactly what he did.
We will move immediately to proceed to the budget resolution with reconciliation instructions and expect to move to vote-a-rama shortly thereafter. I yield the floor.
Senate Leader Chuck Schumer brought the Democrats' $3.5 trillion budget bill to the floor just moments after the infrastructure bill was passed. This budget plan for fiscal year 2022 includes money for social welfare programs, climate change projects, and immigration reform. Our congressional correspondent, Melina Wisecup, is at the Capitol with more details about this bill. Melina, tell us, where is all this money in this sweeping budget plan going to go?
Yes, Steve, so like you just mentioned, this budget bill brought to the floor immediately after that infrastructure bill is very much a list of programs that Democrats want to see implemented. For example, there's over $300 billion dedicated to affordable housing, like rental assistance and public housing initiatives. There's also over $700 billion that would go towards universal child care, pre-K, free community college, as well as increasing the Pell Grant and other education initiatives. Immigration is in there too, over $100 billion to grant citizenship to illegal immigrants, while at the same time there's some funding for tighter border security in that bill too. There's also things like the child tax credit and also paid family and medical leave, as well as expanding Medicare. So all of these are included in this bill. There's also some clean energy and climate projects, which Democrats originally wanted to put in their infrastructure bill, but they knew they didn't have the Republican votes to do that, so they went ahead and put it in this budget bill, Steve.
And we know the Democrats, since they have the majority, can pass it by themselves without any Republican votes. Now, how is this expected to be paid for?
Yeah, some of it would be paid for through taxing wealthy Americans, that is, through raising the corporate tax and more IRS tax enforcement, something that Democrats are calling tax fairness. Now, within the bill itself, Steve, it's actually projected to raise the national debt to $45 trillion by 2031. Of course, Republicans are making some noise about this, namely the ones who voted against the infrastructure bill because they're concerned about the budget deficit and inflation.
And we know some moderate Democrats in the Senate have said they're also concerned about the national debt along with inflation. Now, we know that one reason the Senate is trying to quickly pass this budget bill is because House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says this bill must be passed by both the Senate and the House before she even considers bringing the bipartisan infrastructure bill to the floor.
That's right, Steve, but we know a group of moderate Democrats are urging Pelosi to reconsider this. They want a standalone vote on the infrastructure bill in the House. They want to de-link it from this $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill that Senate Democrats are pushing right now. But whether or not that means those House Democrats will vote against this budget reconciliation bill, that's still up in the air. So we'll just have to see how this unfolds, Steve.
Thanks, Melina. And we know this budget bill notably does not raise the debt ceiling. That's even as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen asked Congress to raise it because if Congress doesn't raise it by the end of September 30th, it could lead to a government shutdown. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announced his resignation Tuesday.
And I think that given the circumstances, the best way I can help now is if I step aside and let government get back to governing. And therefore, that's what I'll do.
New York Governor Andrew Cuomo will step down in 2 weeks. It came after New York's Attorney General released the results of an investigation that found Cuomo sexually harassed at least 11 women. He has resisted calls for his resignation from top Democrats, including President Biden.
I respect the governor's decision, and I respect the decision he made.
What impact, as the head of the party, what impact does his resignation have on the Democratic Party?
I think the impact is all on Andrew Cuomo and his decision to make that judgment, and I respect his decision.
Cuomo still faces the possibility of criminal charges. A number of prosecutors throughout the state are moving to investigate him. A female police officer was murdered in Chicago over the weekend. This is the first time a female police officer has been gunned down in the city since 1988. Our next guests say defunding the police isn't the answer. Americans across the country have been issued a warning for an intense heat wave this week, with several states approaching or even hitting triple digits. 3 people were fatally shot over the weekend in Washington, D.C. The city has seen a rash of shootings and killings in recent months.
At approximately 4:29 p.m. on Saturday, August 7th, members of the 6th District responded to the 3000 block of Nelson Place for the report of a shooting. Upon arrival, members located an adult female victim inside of a residence suffering from a gunshot wound. The victim was transported to an area hospital where, after all life-saving efforts failed, this victim was pronounced deceased.
According to NBC, starting from Friday, there were 12 shootings across Washington, D.C. over the weekend. 3 people were killed and 18 wounded. Crime is rising throughout cities across America, And with some politicians calling to defund the police in the middle of this crime wave, it has residents in these cities searching for answers and the best path forward. Here is a clip from the Democratic Congresswoman Cori Bush, just last week doubling down on her calls to defund the police.
The thing, I won't let them get that off. You can't get that off. I'm going to make sure I have security because I know I have had attempts on my life and I have too much work to do. There are too many people that need help right now for me to allow that. So if I end up spending $200,000, if I spend $10 more on it, you know what? I get to be here to do the work. So suck it up, and defunding the police has to happen. We need to defund the police.
Now, here to discuss the rising crime in our cities and how to address this, we have New York City mayoral candidate Curtis Sliwa and Dr. Troy Jackson. Thank you both for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, anytime.
Now, Troy, I want to ask you first. You just saw a United States Congresswoman calling to defund the police. Is defunding the police the solution, or is there a disconnect here?
Thank you guys for having me. I am honored to be here. I believe there's a huge disconnect. Because as I'm in the inner cities and affiliated with inner cities in New York and Buffalo and Chicago and here in the Dallas area where I am, no one sane wants to see the police defunded, because they understand that when they're in trouble, the first person they're called are the police. They don't call their elected officials. They're not going to call her. And she even made the comment about her having security and still wanting to get rid of the police. That makes no sense whatsoever. So she understands the need for safety and security, but just does not feel that her constituents deserve that.
Curtis, you have been voluntarily providing public safety on the streets of New York through your nonprofit Guardian Angels for the past many decades. So you have a boots-on-the-ground perspective. Do you think defunding the police is the solution?
Not at all. In fact, I and the Guardian Angels have been in an area of Corona, Queens. You may have seen that viral video in which gunmen on mopeds came in and started to shoot 10 people, 3 of them gangbangers, and fired 40 shots. They still haven't been caught yet. We're still patrolling the area. That's AOC's district. All out crazy. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who wants to continue to defund the police. She's never taken a moment to show up there and talk to all of her constituents that are now in lockdown because they fear gang retribution and retaliation, a series of drive-bys. I'm there. Guardian Angels are there. The police are not there because they've been defunded. So AOC leads all out crazy and all the squad follows. And it's do as I say, but not as I do. AOC is protected by armed security. And if you notice, most of the members of the squad are protected by armed security at our taxpayers' expense.
Troy, just the other day in Chicago, there was a police officer. Her name was Ella French, 29 years old. She was murdered during a traffic stop. Do you think that a lot of this anti-police rhetoric emboldens some of these hardened criminals?
I believe it does. And the fact that police departments are cutting the free officers, the reservists, as part of their surrender to Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And so you get rid of the officers that you don't pay, that are the cushion to give those officers that you do pay rest so that they can be fresh on the job. You just eliminate 50 in this department or 80 in this department. It makes no sense. I'm sick of people saying that cops need more training. You had 18 years to teach your kids it's wrong to loot, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to set buildings ablaze, it's wrong to block traffic, it's wrong to point lasers in people's eyes, it's wrong to overturn cars, destroy buildings, and attack citizens. So let's ask the real question: who failed who?
Curtis, are these criminals being emboldened by anti-police rhetoric?
Oh, there's no doubt. Remember, they know there are no consequences. And by the way, if you shoot a cop or you kill a cop, you get props. You get extra cred on your shoulder as being a gangbanger who's off the cop or shot a cop. So you get those stripes. And I'm telling you, they know the way it is now that there's a very good chance that all of a sudden there will be Black Lives Matter or Antifa in the streets and claim that you had no choice but to defend yourselves against killer cops. They've seen this scenario before in the last year and a half. They're hoping it'll happen again. But in the meantime, as they continue their gang wars and hit mostly innocent passerbys, the carnage now will spread to the police and our officials. If you notice, the Chicago PD did exactly what they should have, turned their backs on Mayor Lightfoot when she went to the hospital to find out the update on the condition of the police officer. They should all turn their backs on mayors around the country who would continue to defund the police and continue to render them impotent.
Some have said that more community policing could be part of the solution. After all, police are members of the community and can relate to their fellow neighbors. Should there be more of a call to embrace officers in the community rather than these divisive calls to defund the police? Curtis, I'll give the last word to you.
Well, look, I'm an advocate of community policing. I'm on the forefront of that, having started the Guardian Angels in 1979 and was vilified by the police for 13 years until Rudy Giuliani came into office on a law and order platform and normalized relations between us and the NYPD. But I'll tell you this much, community policing is not going to stop gangbanging as it exists today in most of these major urban areas. We need undercover police officers doing jump outs, doing stop, question, and frisk of known gang members that they have a roster of. They know who the gangbangers are. And look, it's not hard to figure it out, even if they're not on the gang roster of the local police department. They got tattoos on their neck like giraffes, on their forehead, on their knuckles. They throw gang signs back and forth. You know who the gangbangers are. Throw them up against the wall, search them. Search their vehicles, search their mopeds, search their motorcycles, because they feel that they have total impunity to be able to go out in the streets with a loaded 9mm and continue to shoot at one another. You've got to put a stop to it. You can't do it with community policing. You have to have specialized undercover police officers who preemptively do the jump outs. It's called street crime units, and they have been taken from most of the police departments. Portland, Minneapolis, New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. I can go right on down the line. They have basically put on the shelf these street crime units which were so effective in preemptively stopping gang warfare.
Curtis Sliwa, Troy Jackson, thank you both.
Oh, my pleasure, anytime.
Thank you.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Monday said that China is bullying and threatening rules-based maritime order in the South China Sea, in a thinly veiled criticism of the communist regime.
Some may assert that resolving the dispute in the South China Sea is not the business of the United States or any other country that is not a claimant to the islands and waters. But it is the business, and even more the responsibility, of every member state to defend the rules that we've all agreed to follow and peacefully resolve maritime disputes.
Blinken made the remarks during a United Nations Security Council meeting on maritime security on Monday. He warned, quote, "When a state faces no consequences for ignoring these rules, it fuels greater impunity and instability everywhere," end quote. The Chinese regime has continued its aggressive approach in staking its claims in the South China Sea, despite a 2016 international ruling. Most Americans have been issued a warning for an intense heat wave this week, with several states approaching or hitting triple digits. The National Weather Service notes that most people across the U.S. will experience some very high temperatures this week. Especially in the northeast and northwest parts of the country, temperatures will build to 10 to 15 degrees above average. The excessive heat warnings come amid raging wildfires on the West Coast. There are about 100 large blazes burning across 15 states nationwide. Cuba is the only communist nation in the Western Hemisphere, but they continue to receive support from the largest communist country in the world, China. Just 90 miles from America, freedom-seeking Cubans are protesting against the communist regime, but their government is sending Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces to squash the protests. Reports uncover that this Cuban police force was actually trained by the Chinese Communist Party. In response to Cuba's massive crackdown on protests, President Biden imposed more sanctions on the Cuban police force and two of its leaders. Recent reports reveal that this Cuban police force known as the Black Berets has actually been trained by the Chinese Communist Party's armed forces. A Spanish media outlet, ADN Cuba, obtained these photos of Cuban Black Berets with their Chinese leaders. Being in the camp of communism, Beijing and Havana have maintained a good relationship for decades. The two have gotten even closer recently, as there are only a few communist regimes left in the world. Besides, Beijing has been trying to spread its influence over to the Western Hemisphere, especially where it's closer to the United States. In an interview with NTD's David Zhang, the director of the ADN Cuba said that China's People's Armed Police have trained the Cuban Black Berets for at least 6 months this year. Training took place in a facility just 15 miles away from Cuba's capital city of Havana.
They have been sharing private groups like the same organization that has been sanctioned recently by the administration.
Cuba's Black Berets were formerly known as the Special National Brigade. It's a special paramilitary force to repress democracy activists and political dissidents. And during Cuba's protests last month, these Black Berets did just that, beating and arresting freedom-seeking protesters. News reporters were also assaulted. Even in the days following this massive protest, the Black Beret troops conducted violent door-to-door raids, looking for suspected protesters and dragging civilians out of their homes. Journalist Galette Martinez-Fregala pointed out that these tactics are similar to the tactics the CCP's armed police used to squash the Hong Kong protests. What's more, there are reports that Beijing even helped Cuba build its internet censorship technology to block people from passing information and exposing the police brutality. In response, the Biden administration is working on a plan to try to provide wireless communications to Cubans and to set up a U.S. embassy staff in the country.
The United States is taking a concerted action to bolster the cause of the Cuban people.
Now it's left to be seen what more the administration will do to stand by the side of the Cuban people suffering under the communist regime. And that's all we have for you on this edition of the Capitol Report. We thank you for joining us, and please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. I'm your host, Steve Lance, and we'll see you next time.